We have a couple items because of some weather events that kind of threw us behind, and today's the last day for non-exempt bills. A couple bills I did want to take a look at, see what the committee's desires are. Today we will take a look at Senate Bill 80 and then Senate Bill 184, which I had mentioned previously, and they were on the calendar, so there's no secret that these were some we were going to be looking at. So we will start with Senate Bill 80, and just a brief reminder from our reviser exactly what Senate Bill 80 is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So current law provides that the Secretary of Wildlife and Parks may issue non-resident landowner deer permits. Senate Bill 80 would strike this authorization, and the bill would also make a conforming amendment to remove the definition of non-resident landowner.
Questions, committee, of our reviser? All right, we will work. Well, that wasn't someone on WebEx unless that was Senator Titus, and that didn't sound like Senator Titus. But do you know what that was, that noise was? Was that a, okay. Start with Senate Bill 80. There is a definition in statute of a tenant as it relates to a non-resident permit holder. I wanted to tighten that up, so I have a balloon that's been drawn. If it would be passed out by staff, please. This was mentioned to us by Kansas Livestock Association during their testimony, and then I expanded it just a little bit. You will see on page 1, line 11, it adds the words "a resident of Kansas." So this would mean that if a person is a tenant of land, they must be a resident of Kansas and actively involved in agriculture. Currently, tenant would allow pretty much anyone to say they are leasing land and then have a deer tag. I also, because of living on a border and know that all the way around the state of Kansas, we have ag producers who their house might actually, their residence be across the state line, but their property bleeds into Kansas. As a matter of fact, in some cases, the majority of the property that they farm or run cattle on is in the state of Kansas. So this would also allow that person to be considered a tenant for the purposes of landowner deer tags. And sometimes it's not that they own it, but they lease it. They live on a state line, they lease a significant amount of land in Kansas. So this would allow a person who is on or lives in a county that borders the state of Kansas all the way around, whether it's Missouri, Oklahoma, Colorado, Nebraska, if they are living in a county that borders Kansas, then they would also be considered eligible as a tenant for a deer tag. And I think that pretty much covers it. If I left something out, I'm sure my advisor will straighten me out. Yes, and I had failed to mention that further into the bill, it reinstates the stricken language as it relates to non-resident landowners and deer permits, because the bill, so it pretty much just reverses what the bill had done. There was a lot of pushback to the chair, so we would either not work the bill or we would tighten up the tenant language, is pretty much what this boils down to. Questions? I'm not going to make a motion. Well, I'll go ahead and make a motion, and then we can discuss the motion. So I would move that we amend Senate Bill 80 with the balloon that's been proposed. Is there a second? Second from Senator Blue. Senator Blue has a question. Senator Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've been, a drive up here this morning gave me a lot of time to think on this bill. And I represent a ton of outfitters in my district. And so what's happening is these out-of-state hunters are not receiving deer tags through the lottery. And for instance, I have one outfitter that 30 of their hunters did not receive a tag because I don't know what's going on with the wildlife and parks and the tag issue, so forth. So the question I have is they are purchasing land. They are purchasing the 80 acres. They are having land management come in. Farmers are renting out their land, leasing it and working it. So it's not just sitting there unattended. With this, are they allowed to only hunt on their ground that they own?
This does not change current statute. Correct.
Okay. All right. That was my only concern. You took away my big conversation with this amendment, so thank you.
You're welcome to just continue to talk all you wish. We would prefer you didn't.
I know I'm not going to be like other senators and say I'll be brief and keep talking, so thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that little bit of personal comment. Additional comments or questions on the balloon as presented, committee? Senator Shane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my concern with the amendment and with the bill in general is that it doesn't get to the heart of addressing wildlife and deer management in the state. And I understand what the proponents of this bill are trying to achieve, and I agree with the sentiment that we run into struggles, particularly on leased ground, but even sometimes on owned ground, where there may be a list of 20, 30, or even more owners or tenants part of that active lease or part of that land acquisition. And we still end up having an imbalance of hunting pressure per acre in those situations. And I think that's one of the issues that we see particularly with tenants. But I don't know that it warrants going all the way to prohibiting non-resident tenants. And I guess I would like to see our committee take time to explore how we better structure the regulations around the types of tags and how tags are allocated to better reflect sound wildlife management practices rather than kind of doing blanket prohibition of tenant tags, non-resident tenant tags in general. So for me, that's where I'd rather see the conversation go is how we give the secretary the authority if it's allocation of tags on a per acre, you know, on some sort of acreage basis or so on and so forth, so that we can really get to the heart of the issue. I'm not confident that the amendment in the bill in general get to the heart of the issue.
So there was not a question there, just a comment. All right.
Just a comment. Thank you, sir.
Senator Ware.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I don't have a question either, but I have been hearing from a lot of folks who have what sounded like pretty reasonable concerns about the bill as it stands. And if I understood them right, even with the amendments, it would. And so I'd have to agree. Maybe it's time to give it a minute and think about it a little bit more before we have unintended consequences. Yeah.
Additional questions or comments, committee? All right, seeing none, the amendment is designed to put the statute back as it was and then tighten up who is considered as a tenant. The department told me that they are having a lot of issues with tenants. They said that is their biggest struggle and challenge from a law enforcement standpoint, making certain that a tenant is actually engaged in agriculture and who is the tenant of 80 acres or more. And so the chair thought that this would be one way to keep the statute as is, as relates to non-resident landowners, but then tighten up the language for tenants for anyone who is renting or leasing land. So it will be up to the will of the committee. I have nothing further to add, so I will move my amendment. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
No.
Motion appears to pass. Motion does pass. The bill is amended. Are there further amendments before we look at passing the bill out? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize, but we talked when we heard information from the Nature Conservancy, and they had specific language, as you identified as part of their testimony, and it's language that would replace Section K. So if possible, and since that language is specifically identified, I would like to make that as a motion. It's on the Nature Conservancy testimony from February 12th.
So can you direct us in the legislation, Senator, where you're referencing? We'll eventually all find it, but you could expedite that for at least some of us.
It would, this is talking about replacing Section K, but at this point, it allows the same thing for the secretary to issue permits for deer to non-resident landowners, but any such permit shall be restricted and talked about and included in qualified management activities that promote improved native habitat, asking the Department of Wildlife and Parks to develop and provide publicly a list of programs and management plans that meet the appropriate standards of ecological benefit and integrity to be considered, and that conservation organizations may request consideration of qualification for the subsequent calendar year.
So are you making a motion that the language given to us, which committee it is on the back of the testimony from the Nature Conservancy, so is that your amendment or your motion is to adopt this language?
Mr. Chair, that was correct. So I move that we adopt Section K as written by the Nature Conservancy. And I know that they had worked to vet this particular language.
All right, there is a motion. Do we have a second to adopt this amendment? Senator Ware seconds the motion. Discussion on the motion. Senator Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the intent here is good, but I do have some concerns of this sort of being a slippery slope of requiring these practices for all permits at some point, someday, and it kind of changes the voluntary nature of some of these programs. Again, I think the intent is good here, but maybe this is not the place to approach this, so I have some concerns.
This would significantly change the language in K from just simply the secretary may issue permits for deer to non-resident landowners, but any such permit shall be restricted to hunting only on lands owned by the resident landowner. And then and included in qualified management activities to promote improved nature habitat or native habitat. I'll leave it up to the will of the committee. Senator Francisco, comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand the comments from Senator Shane, and in fact, this may also be one of the things we might want to take a little time to look at. But I think it does respond to the concern to make sure that if we are allowing this practice, then we are paying attention to the management of that land. And this would specifically help with that. So I would very much like to see something done in these cases for the land management. So I think it's either stepping back and looking at the additional issue of how we permits or adopt language such as this that's suggested. Because again, I hear that as the concern that if we are having land bought just for this hunting, then how do we ensure that it is managed appropriately?
Additional questions or comments on the amendment? I do have a question. It mentions that there will be a written submission to the department no later than July 1st of the current year. That language is a little unusual. The bill, the legislation, if passed and signed, would take effect on publication of statute book, which is July 1st. So how would that be handled for 2025, Senator Francisco?
My understanding is there would be no opportunity for 2025, but conservation organizations could, in subsequent years, request consideration of qualification. So it's an ongoing process. It would not start immediately, but it would allow the opportunity. So the Department of Wildlife and Parks would have to set those appropriate standards, and then there is an opportunity for other standards to be proposed.
Thank you. Additional questions, comments, committee? Seeing none, Senator Francisco, you may close on your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this does start to identify a process that might make sure that such lands do promote improved habitat. I move the amendment.
You've heard the motion to. You're a little late, Senator. We've already.
Mr. Chair, I was going to offer a substitute motion if that would be appropriate.
It would not at this point because I've already recognized her to close on her motion. So we'll go ahead and vote on the motion, and then if it passes or if you wish to change some things, I'll recognize you. So you've heard the motion to amend with the language provided to us by the Nature Conservancy. All in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, no. No. Motion appears to fail. Motion does fail. Senator Shane, did you wish to offer a motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd move that we table Senate Bill 80 for future consideration.
Okay, had I known that was going to be your motion, that is a priority motion. Okay, there is a motion to table Senate Bill 80, and there's no date set, correct, in your motion?
Correct.
Okay, and there is a second by Senator Titus. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion carries. The bill is tabled. We shall move to Senate Bill 184. Senate Bill 184 is equally as simple. Actually, even less so. As a reminder of what Senate Bill 184 is, we will allow our reviser to the privilege of reminding us what Senate Bill 184 is. Reviser Lawrence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill 184 would amend the Kansas Dry Cleaner Environmental Response Act to modify penalties for violations of the act, the required deductible rate for corrective actions, the environmental surcharge rate, the solvent fee, and the delinquency penalty related to environmental surcharges and solvent fees.
Committee questions of our reviser as a reminder of what the legislation is. Seeing none, I do know that there were several questions during the hearing. Senator Shane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to present an amendment. If Revisor Lawrence could pass around the amendment that would strike the language around the collection of taxes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So while the amendment is being circulated, this amendment would strike lines 25 through 28 on page 8 and lines 12 through 15 on page 10, which would effectively remove the portion of the proposed bill that would have given the Kansas Department of Health and Environment the authority to collect taxes.
Could I get a copy of the amendment, please? The chair might need one. Thank you. Interesting, everyone but the chair. Chair can be kept in the dark every so often. That's okay. So we have the amendment that has been distributed. You can see the red line striking language. There is a motion by Senator Shane on this amendment. Is there a second? Senator Titus seconds the motion. Discussion on the motion. Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a substitute motion,
All right.
and I'll ask our reviser, Lawrence, to distribute that.
I believe all members have the amendment, and so before we discuss, and so you have a substitute motion. Do you want to explain your motion, or do you want me to go ahead and seek a second before you explain? Doesn't matter to me either way. All right. Is there a second to amend or for the substitute motion? Okay, Senator Ware seconds the motion. Senator Francisco, explanation of your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I very much appreciate Senator Shane bringing this concern to the committee, because I think the way it's written, it does talk about the secretary or the director may collect any delinquent taxes. This would say that those taxes need to be assessed pursuant to this act. So it would limit that ability to assess to just those taxes that are related to the dry cleaning. And if this were adopted, it would need to be adopted on both, the language on both page 8 and on page 10. So I think this is the intent. The department argued that it wasn't really enough money for the Department of Revenue to pay attention, but we certainly, if we're giving the secretary that ability, we want it to limit it just to taxes related to this act.
All right, thank you, Senator Francisco. I don't know that I agree that it's needed on page 10, because it says including any interest or penalty assessed pursuant to this act. Okay, we will leave that up to the reviser to determine, but the motion is to amend with that balloon on page 8, and then that same balloon then would be put in on page 10. Discussion on the motion. Senator Titus.
Mr. Chair, just so I'm clear, when we have a substitute motion, we deal with the substitute motion if it's seconded first. If that were to fail, we would go back to the original motion. If this would succeed, we would just move on. Is that correct?
Correct. If this motion fails, we are back on the Shane motion. If this motion succeeds, we move forward to something else.
Thank you.
Additional questions, discussion on the motion. Seeing none, Senator Francisco, you wish to close on your motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this wording does limit the ability for the secretary or the director to collect taxes just pursuant to this act, and I think that was the intention of the wording, and so would help if that was actually the wording we adopted. I move the amendment.
You've heard the motion to amend, the substitute motion to amend. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion appears to pass. Motion does pass. So committee, further amendments on Senator Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the reviser could pass out the amendment on the penalty fees. So in the hearing on this bill, I was concerned at the large increase in civil penalty authority. If you recall, the intent of the department is to remove the specific provisions for dry cleaners and move them just to the General Hazardous Waste Act violations. In doing that, they would remove the statutory considerations on on how to maybe lessen a penalty when it's issued, and would increase the penalty by 20 times the maximum penalty. They did provide follow-up information. I think they went back to, it was 2017, the last time they issued a penalty. My understanding of the philosophy behind civil penalties, it's really to be prohibitive, not punitive. And since we don't have regular violators, to just blanket change the penalty cap by times 20 seems a little bit much out of the gate without more discussion. So I'm simply restoring the original penalty language with the $500 cap and the considerations. If this becomes a problem, I think it's a good discussion to have, but absent people regularly violating the act, I don't see any need to just arbitrarily up the cap. So I would move my amendment on penalty fees.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate this, and I understand the concern about 20 times. Might be more comfortable if we were raising it to at least $1,000, and rather than keep it where it had been for almost 10 years.
I close. And I have one final amendment. If the revisor could pass out on the amendment dealing with seeking out sites. So I was a little bit, again, a little concerned that it was a complete strike of the original language prohibiting the department from seeking out contaminated sites. I like having some guardrails for how aggressively the agency may be seeking out sites. So what I'm proposing is to put that language back in, but to expand it and to sort of make it clear that if they're responding to complaints, if they'd like to put out information and advertising materials, they can do all of those sorts of things. But I think it's appropriate to have just a little bit of a guardrail there. But I did expand or make it clear so that they know they can do regular outreach in their course of business looking for the sites. So I would move my amendment. I close.
I guess I should turn my microphone on so everyone can hear online. I apologize to those listening and to the committee and those in the audience because you probably couldn't hear everything that was said. But there was a motion by Senator Titus on Senate Bill 184 to amend, and so he has closed. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Motion appears to carry. Motion does carry. Further discussion? Motions, amendments? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We also talked during the discussion about corrective action. This would be on page 4, lines 42 and 43, that payment is made for those that have received approval by the department, whether or not such corrective action is set out in the corrective action plan. I was concerned about that wording and asked for an amendment to address that.
I believe all members have a copy of the amendment. Senator Francisco, if you wish to explain your amendment, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This would change the wording to say that payment of costs of corrective action conducted by the department or other entities that have received approval by the department to conduct such corrective action as set out in a corrective action plan. So this would be just saying that there has to be some work to identify what corrective actions should be taken before those payment of costs are authorized. Be happy to stand for question.
Go ahead and move your amendment, and then we'll see if we get a second, and then we'll do a discussion.
I move the amendment.
All right, is there a second on the motion to amend Senate Bill 184? Seconded by Senator Titus. Question on the motion, Senator Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just say I appreciate the clarification. I didn't love that language as it was presented. It seemed to be kind of a carryover from an earlier era, but I thought I had caused enough trouble, so I didn't want to mess with it. But I appreciate the senator from Douglas bringing that. I'll support it.
So you now love the language, is that what you're saying? No, I'm kidding. Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, Senator Francisco, you may close on your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I close on the motion.
You've heard the motion to amend Senate Bill 184 by Senator Francisco. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Motion appears to carry. Motion does carry. We're back on the bill as amended. Further discussion on Senate Bill 184, committee. So no discussion. What's your pleasure, committee, with Senate Bill 184 as amended? Senator Bowser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I make a motion that we pass Senate Bill 184 out of committee favorably as amended.
All right, there is a motion by Senator Bowser, seconded by Senator Francisco. Discussion on the motion. Seeing none. All in favor of passing Senate Bill 184 favorably as amended, signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. No. Motion appears to carry. Motion does carry. That is all that I had for today, committee. We will not meet until after turnaround. The first day after turnaround, when we meet, we will get back to the hearing on, I think it was 211. Senate Bill 211, we will pick up with the opponents of the legislation. And Senate Bill 211 and Senate Bill 213 are both exempt bills, so it will be the chair's intent to take a look at that pieces of legislation fairly closely, and then we will have the great opportunity of getting into budgets as relates to Department of Agriculture and other entities related to this committee. Is there anything additional for the good of the committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned.